Because of the booming success of Modern Horizons, just 2 short years later, we've been blessed with Modern Horizons 2, Horizoning greater. The set looks really fun, just as good as the first one, some might even say better, I guess, if you want to be that daring, and it's bursting with references to lots of things from Magic's past that we all care a ton about, and some we don't at all. But anyway, let's take a look at the 10 main draft archetypes of the set, and then we'll look at what else you can do in Modern Horizons 2. White Blue's theme is artifacts. Now, there are a couple payoffs for this archetype that really want you to have as many artifacts as possible. So cards that grant you more than just one artifact are going to be particularly good in this deck. Barbed Spike and Ethereum Spinner can give you 2 or even more artifacts for just a single card. Barbed Spike is an uncommon, but I foresee this going pretty late in the pack because while a 2/1 flyer for 2 with additional upside is pretty good in a regular draft set, I don't think it's really going to be a high pick in this draft format. So you should be able to get these pretty easily. Ethereum Spinner, however, is actually going to be pretty good in a lot of the decks because while it is an artifact and makes artifacts, you don't actually need artifacts to make it work. So this card actually works in pretty much any blue deck. So this is actually quite a high pick for this deck. Some other assorted tools for this deck. Blacksmith Skill is essentially a white turn-aside with some extra utility. Chrome Courier is like a Sky Scanner, but extra utility and more specific for your deck, so it's going to be harder for other players to take it in draft because they're going to have to be white and blue to play it. Sojourner's Companion is okay, but you really need at least 3 artifacts to make it cheap enough to be playable in this set. A 4/4 for 4 with no other abilities in this set is pretty behind curve, so you really need to have at least that to make it decent, and more than that to make it really good. Of course, it can also cycle to find an artifact land, which is some extra utility, but I wouldn't jam this in just any deck unless you're hitting a critical mass of artifacts. Now, I want to talk about Parselmer, because I think a lot of people underestimate a cheap, early threat that you can trade into a card later on. I think if this were a regular draft set, Parselmer would be the type of card that I would want in most every blue deck as your 2-drop, because it's just really good to get a Piker on turn 2, and once they play a 1/3 or whatever, you can just turn it into a card later. In this set, though, I'm really not sure if it's going to make the cut for the deck, but it is still an artifact, so it's probably going to be decent in this deck. I will say if Parselmer is not making the cut, Floodhound is much less likely to. It's just so expensive to draw a card off of Floodhound, and even if you're just using it to make an artifact to go with the payoffs that I'm about to walk through, it's still just really expensive, and a 1/2 for 1 is just not really where you want to be in any deck. Now let's talk about those payoffs. Lens Flare is a really good removal spell if you have at least 3 artifacts on the field, and the best part about this card is that if you have no artifacts, it's super expensive. Now that may seem counterintuitive, but that means that nobody else is going to want this card except for the red-white deck, which also has to do with artifacts. You're only going to be fighting probably 1, maybe 2 other players at the draft table for this card, and everyone else, even those playing white, aren't going to want it because it's too expensive, which makes it a really good card for you that you can probably get on the wheel. Steelfin Whale has affinity for artifacts as well, and is just a nice top-end card. Vidalcan Infiltrator is another card like Lens Flare that people are not really going to want unless if they're playing artifacts. A 1/3 unblockable for 2 is okay, but it's not really anything you're going to want unless you at least have the possibility to get Metalcraft, which you will in this deck. And finally, Filigree Attendant is the card that just says, no matter how many artifacts you have, I'm going to get better because of it. Now, a 0/3 flyer for 4 may seem bad, but you only need 2 to 3 artifacts to make this start to be decent to really good, and then beyond that, it just becomes a heck of a beater. I do also want to mention that any of the Arcbound cards in white are acceptable in this deck, but not necessarily the best. They're definitely more at home in the white-red deck, but if you're just trying to add some extra artifacts to your deck, nothing wrong with putting them in. Finally, the dual artifact lands, not to mention Power Depot, are all artifacts that will help your Metalcraft and your affinity. These are even higher picks because for your affinity cards, they're essentially tapping for 2 mana. Now, other people are going to be snatching these up just for fixing and the ability to splash, so you might want to take them a little bit higher. Now we're moving on to Blue-Black. Blue-Black's theme is actually really interesting. It's just about discarding cards and giving you benefits for doing so. Some of the main payoffs for this are at uncommon. Mystic Redaction and Feast of Sanity are both finishers that will help you close out the game, assuming you're able to continuously discard cards. Lazotep Chancellor is another uncommon that will allow you to amass an army whenever you're discarding if you have the mana to pay for it. And then some payoffs at common are Recalibrate, just draws you an extra card, and Guiltblade Prowler, which will allow you to draw several cards, assuming you're able to pay the life and the mana. Now, obviously, these cards need you to discard cards, but don't actually grant you ways to do that. The ways that we can discard cards is Aramoeba, Scuttletide, Cabal Initiate, Hell Mongrel, the Underworld Cookbook, and then Dahada's Ploy also offers a 1, or I guess 2-shot discard with a little extra life gain as a benefit. Now, honestly, I think the cards that are best for this deck are these 3 commons, because there's 0 mana to activate, instant speed, and they each offer their own utility. You're definitely going to want at least a couple of these in this deck to really make it work. Unfortunately, you're also going to be fighting black-red decks for this, because black-red's theme is Madness, which, in case you don't know, is about discarding. It's very similar to the blue-black theme. So in addition to wanting Cabal Initiate and Hell Mongrel, just as the blue-black deck wants, you're also going to want Mount Velas Manticore and Viashino Lashclaw as other ways to discard cards for free with a little extra utility. Now, while black-red has a similar theme to blue-black, they actually play out very differently. The blue-black discard deck is going to want to meticulously plan when they discard cards to get the full effect out of them, and they're going to be wanting to play a long game. Black-red Madness, however, is going to be playing aggro, which means you're going to want to be playing your creatures out, discarding cards as quickly as possible, and just trying to kill your opponent by turn 5 or 6. Some of the best Madness cards for this aggro strategy are Kitchen Imp, which reduces its cost by a full 3 mana, which is insane, Skophos Reaver, which is a 4/3 for 2 if you Madness it on your own turn, and then Terminal Agony, which is a decent removal spell in general, but with Madness is going to cost only 2 mana to take anything off the board. In this deck, using just commons, you can have a crazy turn 3 by playing Cabal Initiate on turn 2, and then you can Madness Kitchen Imp and a Skophos Reaver or a Terminal Agony on turn 3, making it so you're hitting for a bunch of damage and setting up for the next turn or removing a creature immediately. One thing to keep in mind in this deck, though, is Viashino Lashclaw is really powerful. Because of the way Madness works, the trigger goes on the stack at the same time that your activated ability is going to go on the stack for Viashino Lashclaw, which means you're actually able to Madness a creature that you discard with the Lashclaw and have it on the battlefield by the time the creatures you control gained haste clause resolves, making it so that you can Madness a creature and immediately attack with it. And while this deck generally wants to play fast, that doesn't mean you can't play a longer game if you want to. Guiltblade Prowler can do just as much work in this deck as it can in the blue-black deck, and a Revolutionist can bring back a Terminal Agony in the late game. And now moving on to the deck that's probably hardest to get to work, Red-Green Storm. The Storm payoffs are Galvanic Relay, Chatterstorm, Spreading Insurrection, Hunting Pack, Ave, Thrasta, and then we have Captain Ripley Vance, and then Arcbound Tracker, which is very easy to overlook because most of the Arcbound creatures are best in the red-white deck, but in this deck the Arcbound Tracker can potentially grow out of control. Now the reason I'm unsure of how this deck will play out is because you really need good common finishers to make a theme work well. Galvanic Relay is just a really bad draw spell, and while a draw spell is definitely a payoff, it's not a win con, and so I'm not sure how this will work. And then the other one is Chatterstorm, which is kind of just a bad Empty the Warrens. Sure, it's cheaper, but you only get 1/1/1 per spell you've cast, and in a limited deck, you're lucky if you've cast 3 or 4, and 4 1/1s for 2 mana is not bad, but it's certainly not going to win you the game most times. Then at uncommon, you have Spreading Insurrection, which admittedly is a good finisher, but it is reliant on there being creatures on the battlefield, which is not always the case. And then Hunting Pack, which is actually a good finisher, but it's so expensive that you're going to have to cast all of your other spells for really cheap or free. Now, we're going to take a look at those cheap spells in a second, but unless you set up like the perfect turn, I think Hunting Pack is going to give you only 2 4/4s most times. And while that's not terrible and can be a finisher, it's not quite as powerful and flashy as people are really thinking it's going to be. While rares and mythics are cool, they don't show up enough for this to make it so that the deck is playable. Captain Ripley Vance is an uncommon that is very powerful, but you're going to have to cast 3 spells several different turns to make it work, which could be difficult. And Arcbound Tracker, honestly, is probably the best card for this deck. This guy's pretty good. He has Menace, and he just keeps growing, so he actually might be the best win con for this deck, but he is just one creature that can easily be removed. So we'll see how this deck comes together, but now let's look at some of the other pieces for it. The Signpost cards for red and green are really powerful, and I would almost say important to make this deck work. Goblin Anarchomancer and Road to Ruin both grant you additional mana or cheaper spells in order to make it so that you can reach that storm count high enough to actually kill your opponents. Road to Ruin also counts as 2 different spells, which can be very powerful for getting your storm count higher. While I am skeptical of this deck playing out, I will say the cards that Wizards included in the set to make it work are really cool. This is going to be almost like building a commander deck in Limited, because you have so many different abilities and mechanics from Magic's history playing together together to make your one theme work. So let's take a look at all the ways you can cast free spells in this set. Rebound will let you cast spells for free on your following turn. Suspend will let you cast spells for free on a future turn, which you'll try to set up as your storm turn. Mind Collapse can be cast for free by sacrificing a mountain. Strike It Rich is essentially free because it replaces its mana with a treasure. Mog Salvage is also a free spell, but they have to be playing blue, and also there has to be an artifact to destroy, so that one's not necessarily the best example. There's a cycle of evoke creatures that allow you to cast them for free, though they are mythics, so they're unlikely to show up in this deck most times. And then if you also have a little bit of the discard outlets from the black-red deck, you can also cast Blazing Root Walla for free. I will say Cascade is another great way to cast multiple spells for cheap, but in this set, you're either going to have to cast something that's off color, or you're going to also have to have Delirium, which is going to be pretty difficult seeing as you already need a lot of pieces to make this deck work, but I wanted to mention it. Finally, there are a couple spells that are not free, but are cheap and repeatable, which is Squirrel Sanctuary and Ragavan if you continuously dash him. These can help increase your storm count, especially for the creatures that want you to cast several spells on several different turns. Let's move on to the green-white archetype, which is +1/+1 counters. Now, if you just look at the rares of the set, you'd probably think that green-white's theme is enchantments, because there are several enchantment cards. However, don't be fooled. Captured by Lagax is the only enchantment at common in either white or green in the whole set, and while it's a good draft pick, it's not enough of a foundation to build an enchantment deck. So don't fall into the trap of taking any of these cards unless you have been lucky enough to pick up several rare or uncommon enchantments in prior packs. With that out of the way, +1/+1 counters. Knighted Myr is a cool new card that benefits you for putting +1/+1 counters on it and comes with a way to do it once itself. This is a cool minor payoff for this archetype that I think you're going to want in most of these decks. And then there's Duskshell Crawler, which is like the 37th iteration of this type of card we've seen, but you're still going to play it because trample. As far as uncommon payoffs, there are enough in the set that you're likely to get one or two, especially since a couple of them are really only good in this deck. Herd Baloth, Monoskellion, Constable of the Realm, and Arcus Acolyte are all really powerful cards that do lots of different things for this deck. Herd Baloth is probably the best one, being a little overcosted for a Masters level set, but once you get even a single +1/+1 counter on there, it's already paid for itself because it just grows out of control. Some of the best ways to put +1/+1 counters on your creatures are Bannerhide Cruciak, which provides 2 different instances of putting counters on your creatures, which can trigger things like Constable of the Realm multiple times. And then Myr Scrappling, I think, is actually going to be a pretty good card for this deck. The ability to put a +1/+1 counter on one of your creatures at instant speed for free is already pretty difficult for your opponent to deal with in combat, but on top of that, you can give your Knighted Myr double strike, you can steal something with Constable of the Realm, or several other different things that makes this really powerful at instant speed. Another couple synergy pieces, Deepwood Denizen is going to make it so you can draw quite a few cards for really cheap if you have just a few counters on your creatures, and because it has Vigilance, Urban Daggertooth is most likely going to be dealt damage at one point or another, giving you at least one trigger of proliferation, which can be really good if your entire board already has +1/+1 counters on them. Lastly, something to keep in mind for this deck is that white has a few modular creatures, which can get extra use out of +1/+1 counters if you have other artifact creatures. Since there are so many good cards for this deck, I wouldn't focus on taking the modular creatures early, but they can definitely support your theme and fill out your curve if you need to. And now let's move on to enemy colors. White-Black's theme is Reanimate. The archetype has a handful of cards that can bring back creatures from your graveyard, such as Late to Dinner, Abiding Grace, Young Necromancer, Graceful Restoration, and Tizarus Charger can bring itself back. Unlike some of the reanimation spells that we've seen in recent core sets, a lot of these are pretty aggressively costed, so assuming you can get creatures into your graveyard that are good enough to reanimate, I think this theme is going to be pretty good. Let's take a look at those creatures now. Soul of Migration can be evoked and then reanimated to make lots of 1/1 flyers. Landscaper Kolos and at rare Timeless Dragon can both be cycled to get lands, and then later can be reanimated. Discerning Taste, Sinister Starfish, and Violent Tumor all put cards directly from your library into your graveyard, and Violent Tumor picks anything that you choose, which means you can get your best, most expensive creature, and the next turn you can reanimate them with just a call of the dinner bell. Now, reanimation is its own payoff, getting creatures for cheaper than you usually would cast them, or just being able to use the same powerful creature over and over and over. However, we also have Breathless Night, which is going to get a +1/+1 counter every time you reanimate something from your graveyard. Definitely a nice 3-drop to slide into your deck that not a lot of other players are going to want, which means you can get it on the wheel very easily. And now we're moving on to my colors. Black-green. And Black-green's theme is... Squirrel! Well, not quite, Doug. At first, I thought it was because of the signpost common and uncommon both having to do with squirrels. But I quickly realized that there are too few of these cards for it actually to be the proper theme. Turns out, sacrifices the theme. Black has Loathsome Curator, Vermin Gorger, and Legion Vanguard, which are all able to sacrifice your creatures for benefits. The problem I came across when I was looking how to put together this deck is that green doesn't actually have ways to sacrifice creatures, except for Glimmer Baron, but they have to be creature tokens. It does, however, have Jeweled Eye Cobra and Funnel Web Recluse, which are both payoffs for sacrificing either themselves or other creatures. And then when I got back to thinking about squirrels, the theme suddenly made sense for the archetype. I mean, who wouldn't want to strangle the life out of one of these fuzzy guys in order to explore? Sacrificing a bushy-tailed vermin to the Vermin Gorger, I mean, that just makes perfect sense. So I take it back. Squirrels fit perfectly in this archetype. You should draft all the cute, adorable ways in this set to make squirrels, and then mercilessly slaughter them for your own personal gain. But I guess if you didn't want to do that with squirrels, you could actually play green-blue instead of green-black. Green-blue's theme is tokens. One of the best cards for this deck is the Ethereum Spinner. Yes, I'm talking about him again. I promise this guy is going to be very good. We've seen a lot of cards in the last year or so that give you a benefit if you cast a spell with converted mana cost 5 or greater. Now those cards are always okay, but generally in a draft deck, you don't want more than 3, maybe 4 cards that cost 5, 6, 7, or anything like that, because you want a lower curve. However, you generally want somewhere between 4 and 6 cards that cost 4 mana in your deck. Which means the fact that Ethereum Spinner benefits you from casting spells that are 4 or greater and not 5 or greater, you more than double the likelihood that you're going to be able to trigger the Spinner's ability. And because of that, this guy is very good. Now, other cards that are good for this deck, Crack Open can take care of a lot of the pesky artifacts that are running around while giving you a treasure. Burdened Aerialist also gives you a treasure. Orchard Strider and Wave Sifter each give you 2 of their respective types of tokens. Chatterstorm might be okay in this deck, but is probably better in the Storm deck, seeing as it has Storm. And then Glimmer Baron gives you a way to eat up all those yummy tokens in order to deal damage to your opponents, which could be really beneficial because you're more than likely just going to have a lot of treasure and food tokens left over that you really don't care to crack, but don't really want to waste either. And Glimmer Baron is a nice way to actually turn those into damage. As far as uncommons, Specimen Collector, Junk Winder, Fey Offering, and Tireless Provisioner all seem like they'd be pretty good in this deck and provide different ways to get the tokens that you're looking for. And probably the most important card for this deck is Combine Chrysalis. Turn your artifact tokens into 4/4 beast tokens, which is really strong. At some point, treasure tokens are pretty much irrelevant. Food tokens, if you're not too low on life, are pretty much irrelevant. And clue tokens are always going to be good. But if you can just turn that into a 4/4 rather than a random card off the top that could be a land, then it's probably going to be better to do so. Moving on to the blue-red archetype, which is Delirium. As far as payoffs, Gouged Zealot, Foul Watcher, and Dragon's Rage Channeler are all pretty good aggressive cards for this strategy. Unholy Heat is a good card even if you don't have Delirium, so you're going to have to fight other people for it. And some cards that are a little bit slower, more long game cards, Lucid Dreams, Raving Visionary, and Prophetic Titan. The Delirium deck requires a lot more draft awareness than probably any other deck in the format, except for maybe Storm. The reason for this is because you need your Delirium payoffs, but you also need to be making sure you're getting enough cards of all the different card types, and you need to make sure you can actually get those cards into your graveyard. You're bound to have creatures in the deck, and creatures die, which puts them in the graveyard. That's the easiest one to get in there. Instants and sorceries are not too hard to draft, and when you cast them, they'll go to your graveyard as well, which means they're pretty easy to get in there. That's when it starts to get a little bit harder. This is when having artifact creatures can be really helpful, because the artifact creature will die, just like any other creature, putting an artifact into your graveyard. We're not even going to talk about planeswalkers, because if you have one, sure, put it in the deck, but more than likely you won't. Lands can be very difficult to put into your graveyard. You're going to want probably some of those discard outlets that we talked about before in order to put them into your graveyard. And that leaves enchantments, which are definitely one of the harder card types to get into your graveyard. But here are the best ones to do it with in this set. Activating a Shattered Ego will put it into your graveyard, and cycling a Battle Plan or even putting a Flame Blitz into your deck specifically to cycle to get an enchantment into your graveyard is totally worth it. Something to keep in mind for this deck, though, is that there are a few cards that have multiple card types on them. In addition to artifact creatures, which we see quite a lot, we actually have a couple enchantment creatures as well, and then there are actually a couple cards that are both sorceries and instants, which will also count as 2 card types in your graveyard. And something to note is Legendary does not count as a card type. It is a super type, just like Snow or Basic, which means it will not increase your Delirium. However, Tribal is a card type and will increase your Delirium. Haha, you all thought I forgot about Tribal, but I didn't, because I'm too afraid of your scrutiny that I spent all night researching and made sure I didn't miss anything. Altar of the Goyf is a card that has Lure twice and Goyf thrice on it, which probably means you think that you should only be playing it if you have a Lure Goyf creature. But actually, just forget all of that text. It is irrelevant. You basically just want to be playing this as another way to get Delirium, because it is the only tribal card in the entire set, which means it is the only one that can add this 8th card type, to your Delirium. So this is a nice card to put in your deck, simply to pitch so that you get both tribal and artifact into your graveyard with just one card. But if you already have Delirium or don't need it at that time, its effect can be pretty decent too. It can just act as an exalted effect for your creatures based on the number of card types in your graveyard, which is already something you're going to be going for. So a little expensive to cast. You generally are going to want to pitch it, but if you don't need more card types in the graveyard, go ahead and cast it and you'll still get a pretty good effect. And finally, the red-white theme for this set is Modular. The cards you're going to want for this deck is Arcbound everything. But basically anything that is Arcbound is good for this deck, because you want a lot of artifact creatures, and when those creatures die, you want to be able to put their +1/+1 counters on another creature. Well, if that other creature also has Modular, then you'll be able to continuously be using your +1/+1 counters, never losing them, and that's going to be too much value for your opponents to overcome. Some other good cards for this deck, though. Marble Gargoyle doesn't look great, and he's probably not, but flying is pretty good when you put tons and tons of +1/+1 counters on it, so this guy can just act as kind of a receptacle for all of your modular creatures, and then he can get in for lots of damage, which can be pretty nice. Plus, he's probably a card that's going to go pretty late in the draft, so you can get him late and not take up an early slot. Guardian Kirin is also going to be good because with the modular creatures, you actually want them to die a lot of times, and there are actually a few ways we're going to see in a second to sacrifice your creatures. So Guardian Kirin, while not being able to get the counters from modular itself, just grows on its own when you are mercilessly murdering your own artifact creatures. Speaking of mercilessly murdering artifact creatures, Slag Strider has affinity for artifacts and then gives you a nice outlet to sacrifice them, which means you can move around their +1/+1 counters at will. Foundry Helix is a nice removal spell that also allows you to sacrifice a permanent. And Extruder is a card that, when I first looked at it, I thought looked terrible because it's an echo card that really isn't all that undercosted, and I still am not sure it's amazing for the deck, but I will say it just adds more counters to your Arcbound Palooza going on, which can be pretty powerful. Even if you just use it for one turn, don't pay the echo cost and just make it so that it's pretty much impossible for your opponents to block without losing all of their creatures. That can be pretty decent too. I think this deck is a lot more straightforward than a lot of the other decks. Just take a lot of artifact creatures. Even if they don't have modular, you'll want enough artifact creatures so that whenever your modular creatures die, you're not losing all of those counters. Now that we've discussed those archetypes, let's talk about some of the awesome assorted cards from this set. Now, as much as I'm remiss to say it, I know Andrew would be disappointed if I didn't point out that milling your opponent is a very real possibility with Fractured Sanity. 14 cards is a good portion of a draft deck, and games will more often than you think go long enough for this to win you the game. But even when that's not possible, you can just cycle her away and no harm, no foul. Now, what I won't do for Andrew is endorse Chance Encounter. Now, there is a minor flipping coin theme in the set. Tavern Scoundrel and Goblin Trap Runner are both decent or pretty good cards on their own, but Chance Encounter is not. Do not play it under any circumstances. I don't care if you have 10 Tavern Scoundrels and 10 Goblin Trap Run. Well, you're just kidding yourself if you're not first picking Dreadmaw every draft. This is probably one of my favorite cards I've ever seen. It's a taxidermy, pachyderm taxi. Frickin' genius. With only one eye, even Garth can see that the reserve list should be abolished. Maybe WotC will catch up eventually. I really don't think there are enough shamans and wizards to make Harmonic Prodigy worth it, but some of the ones that would be really good with it are Ethereum Sculptor and Revolutionist, for just tons of extra value. Loathsome Curator actually works pretty well with the Prodigy, though. Because Exploit will trigger twice, you're able to sacrifice 2 creatures to the Curator, and if you do, each one will trigger again 2 times, meaning you'll be able to destroy up to 4 creatures with it. And finally, there's a minor Wooburg theme that actually seems really cool to play. There's a cycle of Converge cards and a couple Domain cards, which are all pretty decent if you're able to get 4 or 5 different basic land types out. In addition, in order to smooth your mana for a 5-color deck in draft, you have a cycle of basic land cycling cards, Ornithopter of Paradise, Rift Sower, Terramorph, Tireless Provisioner, Road to Ruin, Yavimaya Elder. You're going to want to be green base, for sure. We don't need to discuss that, right? This set looks really fun. And with a lot of the game stores opening up in the US again, hopefully we'll actually be able to play some good old-fashioned paper Magic. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. If you want to watch a draft archetype guide for Strixhaven, go ahead and click the box on the top. And if you want to learn how to pronounce Esmeralda Mardica Diced Kuldakar, then click the box on the bottom.
I think we should call it your grave.
Curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal.